Charlotte Brooks set down the teapot without a single tremor in her hand. 10 years of marriage, and Nathaniel Carter had just told her that her face across his breakfast table made him sick to look at. She did not weep. She did not argue. She rose, untied her apron, folded it once, and laid it beside his plate like a resignation letter. By the time he glanced up from his ledger, she was already past the gate, and the woman he thought he knew would never answer to that name again. Subscribe now. Stay until the very end and tell me what city you're watching from tonight so I can see how far this story has traveled. The kitchen smelled of scorched toast and boiled chicory, the same smell it had smelled every morning for 10 years. Charlotte Brooks stood at the hearth with her sleeves pinned back, pouring coffee into the chipped blue cup that had always been his, not hers. She never asked why he kept the good china for himself and gave her the cracked one. She had stopped asking questions like that years ago. Nathaniel Carter sat at the head of the table, a stack of land papers before him, his quill scratching numbers into a ledger that mattered more to him than the woman standing 3 feet away. He didn't look up when she set his plate down. He didn't look up when she refilled his cup. He hadn't looked up, really looked at her, in longer than either of them could rightly say. "The Hendricks boy came by again," Charlotte said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Wants to know about the fence line near the north pasture. Tell him I'll see to it Thursday." "You said that last Thursday." Nathaniel's quill stopped. He set it down with a small deliberate click against the inkwell, the kind of sound a man makes when he's decided something and wants the room to know it. "Charlotte." His voice was flat-tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Sit down." She didn't sit. She'd learned long ago that when a man told a woman to sit down before saying something, it rarely turned out to be good news, and she'd rather take it standing. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "Do what, Nathaniel?" "The fence I never asked you to. This." He gestured at her at the table at the whole kitchen, at 10 years folded into one motion of his hand. "This face, every morning, the same face across this table, the same silence, the same—" He stopped himself, but not soon enough. "I can't bear the sight of you anymore, Charlotte. I don't know how else to say it plainer than that." The room went very still. Even the fire seemed to hold its crackle. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Not with tears gathering, not with her chin trembling the way he half expected, half wanted, because at least that would have given him something to comfort, something to fix. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a stranger who has just confirmed something she already suspected. "Well?" she said finally, and her voice didn't shake at all. "Thank you for finally saying it out loud." Nathaniel blinked. "That's all you have to say? What would you have me say? Beg, cry? Ask what I did wrong?" She untied the strings of her apron, slow and deliberate, and folded it in half, then in half again. "I've been asking myself that question for 10 years, Nathaniel. I'm done asking it." She set the folded apron on the table right beside his ledger, right beside the coffee cup that was always his and never hers. "Charlotte, you said you can't bear my presence." She was already moving toward the door, and there was nothing hurried about it, nothing dramatic, just the calm, even steps of a woman who had made up her mind before he'd even finished his sentence. "Then I reckon the kindest thing I can do for you is remove it." "Sit down. I didn't mean—" "You meant it." She paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel saw something in her face he didn't recognize. Not sorrow, not anger even, something closer to relief. "A man doesn't say a thing like that by accident. Where in God's name do you think you're going? You've no family left in the county, no. Don't trouble yourself over where I'm going, Nathaniel. You made it clear this morning that where I am isn't a concern of yours." She looked at him one last time, and her voice softened, just slightly, not with tenderness, but with something like pity. "I hope you find whatever it is you've been looking for at the bottom of that ledger. I never could tell what it was." And then she was gone. No suitcase, no trunk dragged down the front steps. She walked out of Carter Manor with nothing but the clothes on her back and the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had already in her heart left this house a long time ago. Nathaniel sat there for a full minute staring at the folded apron on the table, half expecting to hear the door open again, half expecting her to come back in, flustered and apologetic, the way she always had before smoothing things over, making his coffee, asking if he wanted eggs. The door did not open again. He told himself it was pride. Women got their feathers ruffled over small things, and Charlotte would come to her senses by supper, walk back up that lane, with her chin held high, and pretend nothing had happened, same as she always had. He had work to do. The Hendricks fence, the grain accounts, the letter to the bank in Hartford that needed answering. He picked his quill back up and told himself quite firmly that he had more important things to think about than a woman's wounded feelings. By noon, the coffee pot had gone cold on the stove and nobody had refilled it. By supper, there was no supper. Nathaniel stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at a hearth with no fire lit beneath it, a table with no plates set, and felt for the first time in longer than he could remember a small and unfamiliar unease crawl up the back of his neck. He ate cold bread that night alone and told himself it was temporary. 3 days passed before Nathaniel admitted to himself that something was wrong. It wasn't the missing meals, though; those grated on him plenty. It was the ledger. He'd gone looking for the household accounts, the ones Charlotte always kept in a neat, green-bound book on the shelf by the pantry, and found the shelf half empty. Seed costs, supplier payments, the record of what was owed to the miller, to the smith, to the dressmaker in town, who'd been waiting on payment for a bonnet Charlotte had never once worn for herself. None of it was where it should have been. Or rather, it was there, but Nathaniel couldn't make heads or tails of any of it. Numbers that didn't add up, names he didn't recognize. A whole column marked simply CB that meant nothing to him. He rode into town on the 4th day ostensibly for supplies, though if he was honest with himself, he was looking for her. He didn't have to look far before her name came up on its own. Mrs. Carter. The clerk at the dry goods store, a narrow man named Elias Pruitt, looked up from behind his counter with open surprise. "Ain't seen her come through in a few days, no. Though I did hear she settled her account with Widow Bennett before she—" He stopped himself. "Well, I don't rightly know where she's got to, Mr. Carter. Beg pardon?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Settled what account? Pruitt's eyes flicked away, suddenly very interested in a stack of flour sacks. "That's between the ladies, I reckon. Not my business to say." Nathaniel left the store with more questions than he'd walked in with, and a feeling in his gut that he didn't much care for. He rode to Sarah Bennett's place, next to the widow's small but tidy farm, 2 miles down the post road, mostly because he couldn't think where else to go, and mostly because he suspected correctly that Sarah Bennett knew a great deal more than she'd ever let on. She was in her garden when he arrived, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel in hand, and she didn't so much as look up when his horse came to a stop at her gate. "Mrs. Bennett." He dismounted, hat in hand, doing his best to sound like a man merely paying a neighborly call, and not a man whose wife had vanished 4 days prior. "Wondering if you might have seen Charlotte. I've seen her plenty over the years." Sarah rose slowly, brushing dirt from her apron, and finally turned to face him. Her eyes were sharp, the eyes of a woman who had buried a husband and raised 3 children alone, and had long since stopped being impressed by men who thought their presence commanded automatic respect. "You're asking if I've seen her lately, I expect." "I am." "Why is it, Mr. Carter, that you're asking me and not your own wife?" Nathaniel's ears went hot. "That's a private matter." "Everything's private until it isn't." Sarah set her trowel down on the porch step and folded her arms. "You want to know where Charlotte's got to, you go and ask her yourself. I'll not be the one to hand you an answer you didn't earn. Mrs. Bennett, if you know something, I know your wife hasn't slept under a roof of yours in 4 nights, and she hasn't once come to me in tears about it, which tells me she's not the one who ought to be worrying." Sarah's voice was even, but there was steel underneath it. 10 years, Mr. Carter. 10 years that woman kept your house, kept your accounts, kept your name respectable in this county, and you're standing in my garden asking me where she's got to, like she's a hound that slipped its rope. Nathaniel opened his mouth to argue, and found for once in his life that he didn't have a ready answer. Go home, Sarah said, not unkindly, but not gently either. Look at your own accounts. Look at your own house. You might learn something about the woman you've been living with all this time. He rode home with her words sitting like a stone in his chest, and that evening, for the first time in 10 years, Nathaniel Carter sat down at the kitchen table with the green ledger open in front of him and actually tried to read it. It took him the better part of 2 hours to understand what he was looking at. Payments to suppliers. Yes. Household accounts, yes. But woven through them in Charlotte's careful hand were other entries entirely. Sums received not spent. Payments from a printer in Boston. A note dated 8 months prior referencing a commission for Botanical Studies Native Flora Series 2. Another note, this one older, nearly 2 years back, mentioning a name he'd never once heard cross his wife's lips, C. Brooks. Her maiden name. Written not as a signature on some old letter, but as a name attached to payments to commissions, to a whole second life, tucked into the margins of a household ledger he'd never once bothered to open. Nathaniel sat back in his chair, the candle burning low beside him, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Not quite guilt. Not quite fear. Something closer to the dawning, sickening realization that he had shared a roof, a bed, a table with a woman for 10 years, and had never once thought to ask who she truly was. He thought of her hands steady as she'd untied that apron. He thought of her voice calm as still water telling him she was done asking what she'd done wrong. He thought of the folded apron sitting on the table where she'd left it right beside the coffee cup that was always his and never hers, and for the first time since she'd walked out that door. Nathaniel Carter understood with a clarity that turned his stomach cold that he had no idea at all where his wife had gone, because he had never once known where she truly was, even when she was standing right in front of him. The candle guttered low. Outside, the summer wind moved through the fields he owned past the fence he'd never fixed, and somewhere beyond the reach of his lantern light, in a town he'd ridden through 100 times without seeing it, Charlotte Brooks was becoming a woman he had never met. The candle had burned to a stub by the time Nathaniel closed the ledger, but sleep did not come easy that night, and it did not come easy the night after that either. He lay awake staring at the ceiling beams of a bed that felt twice as wide as it had a week ago, turning the name over and over in his mind. C. Brooks. Her maiden name worn like a disguise, stitched into payments and commissions he'd never known existed. He told himself there had to be an explanation simple enough to swallow whole, a favor for a cousin. Perhaps some old family business she'd handled on his behalf without troubling him with the details. But by the third night, even that flimsy comfort had worn through, and he was left staring at the truth, plain and unadorned. His wife had built an entire second life under his own roof, and he had been too occupied with fence lines and grain prices to notice. He rode into town again the next morning earlier than usual before the heat could settle thick over the road. He told himself he was going for supplies. He knew even as he saddled his horse that he was going to find answers, and that the two errands were not the same thing at all. The dry goods store was quiet when he arrived. Elias Pruitt sweeping the front step with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had nowhere pressing to be. He looked up when Nathaniel's shadow fell across the boards, and something in his face shifted, not quite wary, but careful, the way a man gets careful when he senses a question coming that he'd rather not answer. "Mr. Carter?" Pruitt set the broom aside. "Back again so soon?" "I want to ask you something. Elias and I want a straight answer. I generally give those when I'm able." Nathaniel planted his boots and didn't waste time working up to it. "Does the name C. Brooks mean anything to you?" Pruitt's broom hand went still. For a moment he said nothing at all, and that silence told Nathaniel more than any words could have. Then the older man exhaled slow, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying a long while. "That's not a name I've got any right to speak on, Mr. Carter." "Elias, I mean it plain. It ain't my place." Pruitt picked the broom back up, though he didn't resume sweeping, just held it like something to occupy his hands. "You want that answer? You go on down to Widow Hale's print shop, Rebecca Hale. She'll know more than I ever could, and she's under no obligation to keep quiet the way I am." Obligation to who? But Pruitt was already retreating into his store, the bell over the door jangling behind him, and Nathaniel was left standing on the step with his jaw set tight and a name in his ears he didn't recognize. Rebecca Hale. He asked around before he found the place, a narrow brick building 2 streets back from the square. A hand-painted sign above the door, reading Hale Printing and Engraving. In letters, gone slightly faded from sun. He stood outside it a moment before he went in, and he couldn't have said why his heart was going like a drum in his chest over a print shop, except that some part of him already understood he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't take back once he stepped through. The bell above the door announced him. Inside, the smell of ink and paper was thick enough to taste, and a woman of perhaps 45 looked up from a press in the back, her sleeves rolled and her hands stained black at the fingertips. She had a sharp, assessing face, the kind that took a man's measure in one glance, and rarely needed to look twice. "Help you with something?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected who he was, and wasn't especially glad of it. "I'm looking for Rebecca Hale." "You've found her." She set down whatever tool she'd been holding and wiped her hands on a rag, unhurried, making him wait for her attention in a way that felt deliberate. "And you'd be Nathaniel Carter." His stomach dropped. "You know me. I know of you." Rebecca came around, the press arms crossed, and studied him, the way a woman studies a stray dog that's wandered somewhere it doesn't belong. "Charlotte's spoken your name maybe twice in the 2 years I've known her, and never once kindly. Can't say I expected you to come walking through my door." 2 years. Nathaniel's voice came out rougher than he intended. "You've known my wife for 2 years. Longer than that if you count the letters before she worked up the courage to come in person." Rebecca leaned back against the press, studying him. "You didn't know that either, I take it." "I didn't know any of it." The admission cost him something to say out loud, more than he expected. "I found her ledger, payments, a name, C. Brooks. I don't know what it means, and nobody in this town seems willing to tell me plain." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, considering him, and Nathaniel had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being weighed on a scale he couldn't see. "C. Brooks," Rebecca said finally, "is the finest botanical illustrator I have ever had the privilege to print for. Her studies of native flora have gone to publishers in Boston and Philadelphia, near enough to Charleston too, if the last letter I received is to be believed. Naturalists write to her, write to C. Brooks, mind not knowing there's a woman's hand behind that name, asking for commissions, asking to see more of her work, comparing her studies favorably to men who've spent lifetimes at the trade." Nathaniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. "Charlotte? Your wife, yes." Rebecca's voice was flat, almost cruel in its plainness. Though Nathaniel understood distantly that she wasn't trying to wound him, she was simply telling the truth without bothering to soften it for his comfort. "For 2 years I have watched that woman ride into this town whenever she could steal an afternoon sit at that table there." She gestured toward a small work table near the window, stacked with paper and pigment, "and produce work that would make grown naturalists weep, and then ride home again before supper, so you wouldn't ask where she'd been. 2 years, Mr. Carter, and you're standing in my shop asking me what the letters CB mean." The words landed like blows, one after another, and Nathaniel found he had no defense to offer against any of them because every one of them was true. Why? He managed finally, would she hide it? Rebecca's laugh was short and without humor. "You truly don't know. I wouldn't be asking if I did. Because the one time she mentioned wanting to show you her work early on, before I knew her well enough to see the fear in her when she spoke of you. You told her that a woman scratching at plants with a paintbrush was a fine hobby for idle afternoons, but no fit occupation for a man's wife to be spending her time on." Rebecca watched his face carefully as she said it. "She told me that herself, word for word, near as I could tell, because she'd turned it over in her mind so many times, it had worn smooth as a river stone." Nathaniel opened his mouth, though he had nothing to say, because the memory was surfacing now, dim and half buried under a decade of other mornings. Charlotte at the kitchen table with the sketchbook once years back, and himself glancing over it with barely concealed impatience, telling her something dismissive, something he'd forgotten the moment he'd said it, and returning to whatever business had seemed more pressing at the time. He hadn't thought of it since. She apparently had thought of nothing else. I didn't mean... It doesn't much matter what you meant, Mr. Carter. It matters what she heard and what she did with it. Rebecca pushed off from the press and crossed to a flat file cabinet against the wall, pulling open a drawer with the ease of long familiarity. You want to know who your wife is? Look at this. She laid a set of prints on the work table, careful as handling something sacred, and stepped back to let him see. Nathaniel had seen botanical drawings before, in books in the parlors of wealthier neighbors, who fancied themselves collectors of fine things. He had never seen anything like what lay in front of him now. Every leaf rendered with a precision that seemed almost alive veins, traced so fine they looked as though they might still carry sap petals shaded with a delicacy that made the paper seem to hold light rather than merely reflect it. Beneath each drawing in small, careful script, a Latin name and a date, and in the corner of every single page the same modest signature. C. Brooks. His wife's hand. Charlotte's hand, the same hand that had poured his coffee every morning for 10 years without ever once trembling. The same hand he had watched fold an apron into a neat, deliberate square on the morning she left him had produced this. She's good, Nathaniel said, and even to his own ears the words sounded pathetically insufficient. She's better than good. She's exceptional, and every soul in Boston who's seen her work knows it, save the one man who ought to have known it first. Rebecca gathered the prints back up with the same careful reverence she'd laid them down with. You want to find her, Mr. Carter. I expect you already know where to start looking. She's not hiding from the world. She's only ever hidden from you. Nathaniel stood in that print shop for a long moment saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse, and he'd run clean out of the will to make excuses for himself. Do you know where she's staying? He asked, finally quiet. Rebecca considered him a long moment before answering. I do, but I'll not be the one to tell you, and not because I don't trust you to behave yourself, though I don't particularly, but because that woman finally has a life that belongs to her, and her alone, for the first time in a decade, and I'll not be the one who hands a man the map back into it before she's ready to be found. She's my wife. She was your wife, Rebecca corrected, not unkindly, but without softening it either. Whether she still is depends a great deal on what you do from here, and I'd wager it depends not one bit on anything I tell you today. He left the print shop with more weight on his chest than he'd carried in, and rode home slower than he'd ridden in, turning the whole conversation over and over until his head ached with it. That night he didn't touch the ledger again. He sat instead at the kitchen table in the chair across from where Charlotte always used to sit, and tried for what felt like the first time in years, possibly the first time ever, to picture his wife not as the woman who managed his household, but as a person entire unto herself with thoughts and ambitions and a whole hidden life he had never once thought to ask about. He found he couldn't do it. 10 years of marriage, and he realized, sitting alone in that too-quiet kitchen, that he had never once truly looked at her. The next several days passed in a strange, restless fog. Nathaniel went through the motions of running the estate. The fence line finally got mended. The Hendricks boy paid the accounts squared away as best he could manage without Charlotte's neat hand to guide them. But his mind kept drifting back to that print shop, to those drawings, to the sick sinking certainty that he had lived beside a stranger for a decade and called her wife. It was Samuel Brooks who found him next, rather than the other way around. Nathaniel was out by the north pasture inspecting the very fence line that had started this whole business, when he heard a rider approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visiting. He turned to find Charlotte's younger brother reining in hard dust kicking up around his horse's hooves, his face set in an expression that made it clear this was not a social call. Samuel! Nathaniel straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. Didn't expect to see you out this way. I expect you didn't. Samuel dismounted without offering his hand, and there was nothing friendly in the set of his shoulders. He was younger than Nathaniel by 5 years, a surveyor by trade, and he'd never once in 10 years made a secret of the fact that he thought his sister had married beneath what she deserved, whatever the county's opinion of Nathaniel Carter's respectability might otherwise suggest. I've come to say my piece, Nathaniel, and then I'll be on my way, and you can do with it what you like. Say it then. My sister came to stay with me 3 nights past near broke, though she'd never say so plain, and when I asked her what happened, do you know what she told me? Samuel's voice was tight controlled in the way of a man holding on to his temper by main force. She told me you said her face made you sick to look at. 10 years, Nathaniel. 10 years she gave you, and that's the thanks you saw fit to give her. I didn't mean it the way I don't much care how you meant it. Samuel stepped closer, and though he wasn't a large man, there was something in his bearing that made Nathaniel hold his ground rather than retreat. I watched my sister give up everything for this marriage. She had a place at a school in Hartford once, did you know that? Before you. A position teaching drawing to young ladies, a life of her own laid out ahead of her, and she gave it up the day she married you, because that's what a wife was supposed to do. Wasn't it fold herself down small enough to fit inside whatever shape her husband allowed her? Nathaniel felt each word land like a physical blow, because he hadn't known that either hadn't known about Hartford, about the teaching position, about one more piece of his wife's life that had simply vanished into the shape of being his wife, without him ever once asking what it had cost her. I didn't know, he said, and the words felt small and useless in his mouth. That's the whole trouble, ain't it? You never knew, never asked. 10 years under one roof, and you couldn't be bothered to ask my sister a single question about who she was before she was Mrs. Carter. Samuel's jaw was tight, his eyes hard. She came to my place with nothing but the clothes she was wearing, and she sat at my table and cried for the first time in longer than I can remember seeing her cry. And do you know what she said through it? She didn't curse your name. She didn't call you cruel. She said she was tired of being furniture in her own life. The words hit Nathaniel somewhere he had no defense prepared for, and he found himself sitting down hard on the fence rail he'd just finished mending, because his legs didn't feel entirely steady beneath him. Where is she, Samuel? You think I'd tell you? Samuel's laugh was short, humorless. After what you said to her, I want to make it right. Do you? Samuel studied him with open skepticism. And how do you propose to do that exactly? Ride up to wherever she's staying, tell her you're sorry, and expect 10 years of being invisible to just wash away because you finally noticed she existed. Nathaniel didn't have an answer for that, and his silence seemed to confirm something Samuel had already suspected. That's what I thought. Samuel swung back up onto his horse, looking down at Nathaniel with something that might, in a different man, have almost passed for pity. You want to earn her back, Nathaniel? You're going to have to do a sight better than words. My sister's spent a decade listening to what men tell her. She's done listening. If you want her to believe you've changed, you're going to have to show her. And I don't mean with some grand gesture that makes you feel better about yourself for an afternoon. I mean every day for as long as it takes, whether she's watching or not. He turned his horse before Nathaniel could respond and called back over his shoulder as he rode off. And don't come asking me where she's got to again. That's not mine to give you. If you want to find her, you're going to have to earn that too. Nathaniel sat on that fence rail a long while after Samuel's dust had settled, staring out at land he'd spent his whole life building and realizing with a clarity that felt almost physically painful that none of it had meant a damn thing to the one person who'd spent 10 years standing beside him while he built it. He didn't find her that week nor the week after. He tried road to Hartford on a hunch, thinking of the teaching position Samuel had mentioned, only to learn from a tight-lipped headmistress that no Mrs. Carter had not inquired after her old position. And even if she had, that was hardly information. The school was in the business of sharing with husbands who came around asking after wives who'd apparently seen fit to leave them. He tried Rebecca Hale's shop again twice, and was turned away both times with the same flat refusal. Though the second time, Rebecca's expression had softened just slightly, just enough that Nathaniel walked out with the impression unconfirmed, but unmistakable, that Charlotte was still somewhere close, still within the reach of that town. If only he could find the thread that led to her. It was Sarah Bennett in the end who gave him the push he needed, though not in the way he expected. He'd taken to riding past her farm every few days, not stopping, just passing, as though some part of him hoped she'd flag him down with news. On the fourth such pass she did. Mr. Carter? She was at her fence when he rode by, and her voice carried enough command that he reined in without quite meaning to. You've been riding past my place like a dog circling a bone. It's too proud to ask for outright. Mrs. Bennet, I'll not tell you where she is. Sarah held up a hand before he could ask. That's not mine to tell, and you'll not get it from me any sooner than you got it from Rebecca or from Samuel. But I'll tell you this much because I think you've earned at least this small mercy for finally asking the right questions instead of demanding easy answers. She studied him a long moment, weighing something. There's a gathering at the town hall come Saturday next. A showing of new work by local artists and craftsmen, sponsored by some of the Boston publishers who've taken an interest in what's coming out of this county. I'd wager a woman who's spent 2 years building a name for herself under a false one might finally be ready to let that name be seen in the open in her own town, among her own people. Nathaniel's heart began to pound. Charlotte will be there. I didn't say that. Sarah's eyes were sharp, knowing. I said there's a showing, and I said I'd wager. What you do with that wager is your own business, Mr. Carter, and I'd think carefully before you do anything with it at all. A woman doesn't come out from behind a false name to be ambushed by the husband who never once bothered to learn her true one. If you go quiet. You go to see, not to demand. You understand me? I understand. Do you? Sarah's gaze didn't waver. Because I've watched a great many men say they understand a thing and then go and prove the very next moment that they understood nothing at all. Charlotte Brooks has spent 10 years disappearing a little more each year in that house of yours. If you want her back, Nathaniel Carter, you are going to have to learn to see her as something more than a wife who serves your coffee. And I promise you, that is a harder thing to learn than it sounds sitting on the back of a horse. Nathaniel rode home that evening with something twisting hard in his chest, some mixture of hope and dread he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember, and for the first time since Charlotte had walked out that door, he found himself almost afraid not of losing her. Though that fear sat there too, but of the man he might find himself to be, if he finally truly looked at her, and understood at last everything he had failed to see. The days leading up to that Saturday crawled by slower than any Nathaniel could remember living through. He threw himself into the estate's work with a kind of desperate energy, as though hard labor might somehow balance the ledger of 10 years' neglect. Though some quiet, honest part of him understood that mending fences and paying suppliers on time was not the same thing as learning to see a person, he went back to the Green Ledger more than once that week, reading it now, not for what it might tell him about missing accounts, but for what it told him about the woman who'd kept it. He found tucked between entries for flour and lamp oil small annotations he hadn't noticed before. Dates that corresponded, he realized slowly, to letters from publishers, commissions accepted, deadlines met, all folded quietly into the margins of a household ledger so that her other life could exist invisibly alongside the one she'd been permitted to have. He found himself more than once picking up one of her old sketchbooks from a shelf he'd never bothered to examine closely before flipping through pages of studies. Wildflowers from the meadow behind the house. A hawk she must have watched from the kitchen window. The veins of an oak leaf rendered so precisely he could nearly feel the texture of it beneath his fingers. He had walked past these books for years. He had never once opened one. Thursday evening, Samuel Brooks appeared again, though this time he didn't ride up looking for a confrontation. He found Nathaniel in the barn, mending a bridle by lamplight, and stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking. Heard you've been asking around town all week. I have. Heard you went to Hartford. I did. Samuel came further into the barn, leaning against a post, arms crossed, though the hostility that had crackled off him during their last conversation had cooled into something more measured, more watchful. She doesn't know you've been looking. I didn't expect she would. Good. Samuel was quiet a moment. She's not ready to be found yet, Nathaniel. Not by you, not on your terms. But I'll tell you something. My sister doesn't know I'm telling you, and if you breathe a word of where it came from, I'll deny it to my dying breath. He studied Nathaniel carefully, as if still deciding whether the man in front of him deserved the words that came next. She's frightened. Not of you, don't flatter yourself that far. She's frightened that if she lets herself be seen now fully as who she really is, that whatever you feel for her will curdle into something worse than indifference. Resentment maybe, or worse, that you'll only want her back because of what she's become, not because of who she's always been. Nathaniel set down the bridle, his hands going still. That's not... I don't know what it is or isn't, Nathaniel. I only know what my sister fears, and I know she spent 2 years building something entirely her own brick by careful brick, and she is terrified of watching you walk in and claim it as though it were always yours to claim. Samuel pushed off from the post. You want to prove her wrong? You're going to need more than good intentions. Saturday's showing if you go, and I suspect you will. Whatever Sarah Bennett told you to keep it quiet, you go as a man who has come to see her work, not a man who has come to reclaim his wife. Those are two very different things, and my sister will know within the first minute which one you are. He left before Nathaniel could respond, and Nathaniel sat alone in the barn a long while after the lamplight guttering low, turning Samuel's words over and over until they'd worn as smooth and heavy as river stones in his mind. Saturday arrived hot and still, the kind of late summer day that made the whole county feel slow and syrupy, and Nathaniel dressed with more care than he had in years, though he couldn't have said if pressed exactly what he was dressing for. Respectability, perhaps. Or perhaps some small, foolish hope that looking presentable might somehow translate into being forgiven. The town hall was already crowded by the time he arrived, more crowded than he'd expected, for what he'd imagined would be a modest showing of local craft. Tables lined the walls, displaying woodwork and needlework, and a handful of oil paintings from artists he vaguely recognized from church on Sundays. And at the center of the room, drawing the thickest cluster of onlookers, stood a display unlike anything else in the hall. A series of botanical studies, matted and framed with a care that spoke of real investment, real belief in the work's worth. He didn't need to see the signature to know whose hand had made them. He recognized the style immediately, the same precision he'd seen in Rebecca Hale's shop, the same aliveness in every leaf and petal. But it was the small placard beside the display that stopped his breath entirely. It read in careful printed letters, "Featured artist Charlotte Brooks Carter." Not C. Brooks. Not a hidden initial tucked into a ledger margin. Her full name, both names printed for the whole county to see. He found her a moment later, standing near the display in a dress he didn't recognize. Deep blue, simple but well-made, her hair done in a way that struck him as somehow both familiar and entirely new. As though he were looking at a woman he'd known his whole life and had never truly seen until this exact moment. She was speaking with a gentleman Nathaniel didn't recognize. Older, well-dressed, clearly a man of some standing, listening to her with the rapt attention of someone who understood he was in the presence of real talent. The pigment mixture took nearly a year to perfect. Charlotte was saying, her voice carrying a warmth and confidence Nathaniel had never once heard directed at him in 10 years of marriage. Native plants don't hold color the way European specimens do, not once they're pressed. You have to catch the true shade while the bloom is still living, or the whole study rings false. Remarkable, the gentleman said. Truly remarkable, Mrs. Carter. I've been telling colleagues in Boston for months that American botanical illustration has found no finer hand than yours, and now seeing the work in person, I understand why. Charlotte's smile when it came was small and genuine, and it struck Nathaniel like a physical blow, because he could not remember, try as he might, the last time he had been the reason for that particular smile. That was when she saw him. Her expression didn't crumple the way he might have feared, nor did it harden with anger, the way some cowardly part of him had almost expected, almost prepared himself to weather. Instead, something far more devastating happened. Her face simply went carefully, deliberately, still. The practiced stillness of a woman who had spent 10 years learning to hide what she felt, and had apparently not yet unlearned the habit. "Excuse me," she said to the gentleman beside her, and crossed the room toward Nathaniel with even unhurried steps, exactly as she had crossed the kitchen toward the door the morning she left him. You shouldn't have come, she said quietly, once she was close enough that no one else could hear. I wanted to see it. Your work. I wanted to see it, Charlotte. You could have seen it any day of the last 2 years if you'd ever once asked to see what I was working on at that kitchen table. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath the calm that hadn't been there in years, a woman no longer willing to soften every hard truth for his comfort. Why now? Because I finally understand what I was too blind to see before. He kept his voice low, aware of the room around them, aware that this was neither the time nor the place for the conversation he desperately wanted to have. I read your ledger. I went to Rebecca's shop. I talked to Samuel, to Sarah Bennett. I've spent 2 weeks learning who my wife actually is, Charlotte, and I am ashamed, genuinely ashamed, that it took you leaving for me to finally do it. Something flickered across her face there, and gone too quickly for him to name it. Shame is easy, Nathaniel. Shame doesn't cost a man anything but a little discomfort for an evening. I know. Do you? She studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away and made him force himself instead to hold her gaze. Because I have spent 10 years being invisible in my own home, and I have spent 2 years building something that belongs entirely to me, and I will not fold it back down small again, just because you've finally decided to notice I exist. I'm not asking you to fold anything down. The words came out rougher than he intended, more urgent. I don't want the woman who disappeared into that kitchen for 10 years, Charlotte. I want to know the woman standing in front of me right now, the one Rebecca Hale calls exceptional, the one Boston publishers write letters begging for more of her work. I was a fool not to know her sooner, and I don't expect you to forgive that in one conversation in a crowded town hall. I only wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it. And I intend to keep seeing it whether you ever let me back into your life or not. Charlotte was quiet a long moment, her composure cracking, just barely at the edges, a slight unsteadiness in her breath, a brightness gathering in her eyes that she blinked back with visible effort. You have no idea, she said finally, low and unsteady. How many years I waited to hear you say something like that. I know I don't deserve to say it now. No, she agreed, quiet but unflinching. You don't. Not yet. She glanced back toward the gentleman she'd been speaking with, who was watching their exchange with polite, careful discretion, clearly sensing he'd stepped into something private. I have people waiting to speak with me, Nathaniel. Important people. This showing means a great deal to me, and I won't have it overshadowed by whatever this is. I understand. I'll go. He hesitated one more thing, pressing urgently against his teeth before he could stop himself from saying it. Your work is extraordinary, Charlotte. I mean that. Not because I'm trying to win you back. Because it's true, and you should have heard someone say it to your face a long time before tonight. He turned to leave before she could respond, because he understood with a clarity that felt almost physical. That Samuel had been right. That tonight was not his to claim, that whatever ground he hoped to rebuild would have to be earned one honest day at a time, not seized in a single desperate conversation at a crowded town hall. He was nearly to the door when her voice stopped him. Nathaniel. He turned. Charlotte stood exactly where he'd left her, her arms wrapped loosely around herself, an expression on her face he couldn't quite read. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But not the flat, closed-off stillness from before, either. Something had shifted. Some small crack had opened in the wall she'd built, even if neither of them yet knew what might come through it. The exhibition in Boston, she said. The one Rebecca's been arranging. It's happening in a few weeks' time. A proper unveiling before real naturalists, real publishers, not this. She gestured faintly at the town hall around them. This was only ever a rehearsal. I didn't know. I'm not telling you so you'll come. Her chin lifted slightly, some of the old steel returning to her voice. I'm telling you because I think you should hear it from me and not from Sarah Bennett cornering you on the road again. Charlotte, whatever you need from me, whatever distance, whatever time, I'll give it. I mean that. She held his gaze a long moment, searching his face for something, and whatever she found there, she didn't say. She only nodded once, small and controlled, and turned back toward the gentleman waiting to speak with her. leaving Nathaniel standing near the door of a crowded hall, watching the woman he had shared a decade with move through a room full of strangers who truly saw her with an ease he had never once managed to find in 10 years of marriage. He rode home alone that night, beneath a sky thick with summer stars, and for the first time since she'd walked out his door with nothing but the clothes on her back, Nathaniel Carter allowed himself to feel something he hadn't dared feel until now. Not certainty that he'd win her back. Not even hope, not exactly. Just the quiet, resolute understanding that he had finally begun, however late, however clumsily, to see his wife, and that truly seeing her, was only the first and smallest step of a much longer road. He had no choice now but to walk. 2 weeks passed, and in that stretch of time, Nathaniel learned more about patience than he had in 35 years of getting exactly what he wanted through sheer will and steady hands. He did not ride to wherever Charlotte was staying. He did not send letters begging for reconsideration. Instead, he did the harder thing. He worked, and he waited, trusting that Samuel's warning about earning rather than demanding had been the truest thing anyone had said to him in a decade. He was mending the smokehouse door on a Tuesday morning, sweat soaking through his shirt, when a rider he didn't recognize came up the lane at a trot, too brisk for a casual visit. The man dismounted with the crisp efficiency of someone used to delivering unwelcome news for a living, and Nathaniel set down his hammer with a growing unease. "Mr. Carter." The man produced a folded paper from his coat. "Nathaniel Carter of Carter Manor." "That's me. I'm here on behalf of Magistrate Aldous Pratt, representing a claim filed by your cousin Josiah Carter regarding the boundary and title of this property." The man held out the paper as though it might bite him. "You're being asked to appear before the county court in 3 weeks' time to answer to it." Nathaniel took the paper with hands that had gone suddenly cold, despite the summer heat. "Josiah hasn't set foot on this land in 15 years. That may be so, sir, but the claim states that the original deed granting this property to your late father contained an error in the surveyed boundary lines. An error that, if corrected, would place near 200 acres of this estate, including, I believe, the northern pasture and the timber stand, under dispute with rightful ownership reverting to the elder Carter line, that being your cousin." "That's absurd. My father held this land clean for 30 years, no dispute, no question. I only deliver the summons, Mr. Carter. The particulars are for the court to decide." The man tipped his hat, unmoved by Nathaniel's rising color, and remounted his horse. 3 weeks. I'd advise you find yourself a competent man of law before then." Nathaniel stood in the yard long after the rider had disappeared down the lane, the paper trembling slightly in his grip, though whether from anger or fear, he couldn't rightly say. Josiah Carter. He hadn't thought of his cousin in years, a distant, ambitious man who'd always resented that the family estate had passed to Nathaniel's father and not his own, who'd left the county under some cloud of scandal Nathaniel had never bothered to learn the particulars of, and who apparently had returned now quiet and calculating with a legal claim that threatened to strip away the very land Nathaniel had spent his whole life building his identity around. He rode into town within the hour, the summons folded tight in his coat pocket, and found himself, not for the first time in recent weeks, standing outside a door he had never before had cause to knock on. This one, belonging to a lawyer named Thomas Whitfield. A careful, precise man, with spectacles perched low on his nose, and a reputation for honesty that mattered more to Nathaniel now than any promise of a favorable outcome. Whitfield read the summons twice through before setting it down on his desk, folding his hands and studying Nathaniel over the rims of his spectacles. "Do you know what this is truly about, Mr. Carter?" "I assume it's about the land. My cousins always resented that it passed to my father instead of his. Land disputes rarely spring up out of nowhere after 15 years of silence. Mr. Carter, particularly not disputes, built on a supposed surveying error nobody thought to mention for 3 decades. Whitfield removed his spectacles entirely, cleaning them, with a slow, deliberate motion that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully. "I'd wager there's more behind this than a boundary line. Has anything changed recently in your circumstances? Anything that might make a man like your cousin believe the timing was suddenly favorable?" Nathaniel opened his mouth to say no, and then stopped because something cold and unpleasant had begun crawling up the back of his neck. "My wife left me a few weeks back," he said slowly. "It's become something of common knowledge in the county." Whitfield's expression sharpened. "And do you know where your cousin has been spending his time since his return?" "I don't." "I'd suggest finding out." Whitfield replaced his spectacles. "Men like Josiah Carter, from what little I know of his reputation, don't typically move against a settled, respectable household. They move against households that look from the outside like they're coming apart at the seams. A man with a wife who's abandoned him no clear heir, and a household in visible disarray, that's precisely the sort of target that makes a legal claim built on shaky ground look a good deal more promising than it might otherwise." Nathaniel felt something twist hard in his chest. "He's using Charlotte leaving as an opening. I couldn't say for certain not yet, but I'd advise you proceed as though that's exactly what's happening, and I'd advise you find out everything you can about the original survey and the deed your father held, because if there's an error to be found in decades-old paperwork, we need to find it before the court does, and understand exactly what we're standing on before Josiah Carter's lawyers finish building whatever case they're constructing." Nathaniel left Whitfield's office with a knot of dread sitting heavy in his stomach. And it was only as he was mounting his horse that a second more unsettling thought struck him. If Josiah's claim succeeded, if the northern pasture and timber stand were stripped away, the estate's value would be gutted, its standing in the county diminished, its future thrown into question, and Nathaniel would have nothing left to offer. Charlotte, should she ever consider returning to it, but a name attached to a smaller, weaker version of everything he'd once had. He rode home turning the problem over from every angle he could manage, and it was 2 days later, going through the estate's old records, in search of the original survey, that he found the second blow waiting for him. A letter decades old, tucked into the back of a strongbox he hadn't opened since his father's death. Written in a hand he recognized as his own father's, addressed to a magistrate whose name he didn't know, discussing some manner of dispute over the northern boundary that had apparently been settled quietly sometime before Nathaniel was even born. He brought the letter straight to Whitfield the following morning. "This changes things," Whitfield said. Reading it through twice, his brow furrowed with the particular intensity of a man who scented an advantage. "If this dispute was settled once already and settled in your father's favor, there should be a record of that settlement in the county archives. If we can locate it, your cousin's claim collapses entirely. There'd be no error to correct, because the matter was already resolved a generation ago." "Then let's find it. It won't be simple. Records from that era are poorly kept, and if I'm right about your cousin's intentions, I wouldn't put it past him to have already tried locating and, shall we say, misplacing that very record himself, assuming he's aware it exists." Whitfield set the letter down carefully. "We'll need to move quickly and quietly. If Josiah Carter learns we're looking for this before we find it, he'll have every incentive to make certain we never do." The following days blurred together in a haze of dusty archive rooms and county clerks who seemed, without exception, entirely unmotivated to help a man dig through decades of disorganized paperwork on short notice. Nathaniel spent long hours bent over crumbling ledgers and faded survey maps, his hands stained with old ink and older dust driven by something he hadn't felt in years, not obligation, not habit, but a genuine burning need to protect something worth protecting. It was on the 5th day of searching in a back room of the county archive that smelled of mildew and neglect that he found it a settlement record dated some 31 years prior, bearing his father's signature and the seal of a magistrate long since dead, confirming the northern boundary exactly as it stood today, with no error, no dispute, nothing left for Josiah Carter's claim to stand upon. Nathaniel nearly wept with relief right there in that dusty room, and it was only as he was carefully rolling the document to carry it safely back to Whitfield that a clerk, an older man who'd been reluctantly assisting him, mentioned something in passing that turned his relief cold again almost instantly. "Funny thing," the clerk said, watching Nathaniel secure the document. "You're not the first Carter through here asking after old survey records this month." Nathaniel went very still. "Who else came looking?" "Younger fellow. Didn't give his full name, though he had the look of you about the jaw, if you don't mind my saying. Came through here near 3 weeks back before your summons was ever filed, from what I understand, asking about the very same boundary. 3 weeks back, before the summons had even been filed. Which meant Josiah hadn't simply stumbled onto some old grievance and decided spontaneously to pursue it. He'd been planning this, researching it, laying groundwork for weeks before he'd ever moved to file his claim, and he'd very likely known about this settlement record all along. Did he take anything, copy anything? The clerk shrugged, uncomfortable now. Can't say for certain. I wasn't watching him every moment. But he was in this very room a good long while, and I do recall him asking a great many questions about which records were, shall we say, easiest to lose track of. Nathaniel rode straight to Whitfield's office, the settlement record clutched tight against his chest, and relayed everything the clerk had told him. He's trying to bury this record before you find it, Whitfield concluded grimly, or he already found it himself, and has been hoping nobody else would think to look. Either way, Mr. Carter, we need to move on this immediately. I want this document filed with the court today, witnessed, notarized, entered into record beyond any possibility of it conveniently disappearing between now and your hearing. They rode together that very afternoon to file the record, and Whitfield's urgency proved well-founded. The court clerk who received the document seemed almost surprised by its existence, muttering something about how he'd have sworn that particular file was missing entirely from the archive. A comment that sent a fresh chill through Nathaniel, even as the immediate danger passed. That evening, sitting alone in his kitchen with the weight of the last several days finally beginning to settle, Nathaniel found himself wishing with a fierceness that startled him that Charlotte was there. Not for her hands, not for her coffee, not for anything she had ever done for him in 10 years of quiet, invisible service, but simply for her counsel, her steadiness, the particular clarity of mind that Sarah Bennett and Rebecca Hale, and even her own brother, had described to him in fragments over these past weeks, painting a picture of a woman whose judgment he had never once in a decade of marriage thought to seek out. He hadn't seen her since the town hall showing. He'd kept his word, kept his distance, thrown himself instead into legal battles and dusty archives, and some small aching part of him wondered whether she even knew what was happening to the estate, or whether she'd simply assume, if word of the dispute reached her at all, that it was one more piece of his life unfolding entirely separate from hers. He was wrong about that. As it turned out, though, he wouldn't learn just how wrong until 2 days later, when Rebecca Hale herself appeared at his door, unannounced, her expression grave, in a way that immediately set his nerves on edge. "Charlotte sent me," Rebecca said without preamble once he'd led her into the kitchen. "She's heard about the land dispute. Word travels fast in a county this size, and faster still when the man doing the disputing has been making a great deal of noise about it in taverns and church halls, hoping to turn public opinion before the matter ever reaches court. Josiah's talking about it publicly. Josiah's telling anyone who'll listen that Nathaniel Carter's household has fallen into such disarray, wife-gone, estate mismanaged, that it's practically a mercy for the land to revert to someone capable of managing it properly. He's building sympathy for himself before a single word of testimony's been heard." Rebecca's mouth was tight with distaste. It's a coward's strategy, but coward strategies work often enough when nobody's paying close attention. Nathaniel felt fresh anger rising hot and immediate. "And Charlotte's heard all this." "She has, and before you ask, no, I'm not here because she sent word she wants to see you." Rebecca held up a hand before he could get his hopes too far ahead of themselves. "She's here because she's worried, Nathaniel, whether she'd admit that to your face or not, and because whatever's happened between the two of you, she's still Charlotte Carter in the eyes of this county, whatever name she signs to her illustrations. And she'll not stand by silently while a man like Josiah tries to use her own departure as a weapon against you." "What is she going to do? That's not for me to say. But I'd expect, if I were you, that you'll be hearing from her directly before very much longer." Rebecca studied him a moment longer, something almost sympathetic crossing her sharp features. "For what it's worth, Nathaniel and I never expected to say this to you of all men. I hope you win this. Not for your sake, for hers. Whatever's left of her home, whatever she comes back to, if she comes back to anything at all, I'd rather it not be picked apart by a vulture cousin while she's off building her own name in Boston." Rebecca left as abruptly as she'd arrived, and true to her word, it was only 3 days later that Charlotte herself appeared at Carter Manor for the first time since the morning she'd walked out of it. She came in the late afternoon riding alone, and Nathaniel nearly dropped the tool he was holding when he saw her coming up the lane, because some part of him had genuinely believed, despite Rebecca's visit, that he might not see her again before whatever reckoning the court had in store for him. She dismounted with the same composed, deliberate grace she'd carried out the door weeks before, and stood facing him across the yard with an expression that gave away nothing of what she was feeling. "I've heard what Josiah's saying about this house," she said without any greeting at all. "About me." "Charlotte, I'm not here to reconcile Nathaniel. I want that understood plainly before we say another word." Her voice was steady, controlled, though there was something underneath it, some current of real feeling she was working hard to keep contained. "I'm here because I'll not have my name used as a weapon to strip this land out from under you, whatever has or hasn't been settled between the two of us. I appreciate that, truly, but I don't want you putting yourself in the middle of a legal fight that has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me." Her chin lifted, that familiar steel returning to her posture. "This was my home for 10 years, Nathaniel, whatever else it was or wasn't. I managed its accounts. I know its history better than you might credit me for. And if there's a way I can help you fight off a man who's building his entire case on the idea that this household collapsed the moment I walked out that door, then I intend to help for the sake of the land itself, if nothing else." Nathaniel studied her, something warm and painful blooming in his chest, despite the circumstances. "What do you propose?" "Josiah's strategy relies on public sympathy, on painting this house as broken beyond repair. If the county sees us standing together, not reconciled, not pretending at some happy ending, we haven't earned, but simply united against a man trying to exploit our private troubles for his own gain, it undercuts everything he's been whispering in taverns for the past month." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not offering to come home, Nathaniel. I'm offering to stand beside you at your hearing, as your wife in name if nothing else, and make it plain to the whole county that whatever difficulties this household has faced, they are ours to work through, and no outsider has any claim to profit from them." It wasn't everything he wanted. It wasn't even close to everything he wanted, but it was more than he'd had any right to expect, and Nathaniel found himself nodding before he'd fully finished thinking it through. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I mean that, Charlotte. More than you probably believe I do. Don't thank me yet." Something flickered across her face, brief and complicated. "This doesn't change what happened between us. It doesn't undo 10 years, and it certainly doesn't answer whatever's supposed to come after the hearing's settled one way or the other. This is only about the land, Nathaniel, about what's right. Don't mistake it for anything more." "I won't," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, some small, stubborn hope had already begun taking root in his chest, one he knew better than to voice aloud. The hearing, when it finally arrived 3 weeks later, drew a crowd larger than Nathaniel had anticipated. Half the county, it seemed, had turned out to witness whatever spectacle Josiah Carter's claim might produce. And Nathaniel felt the weight of every eye in that courtroom, the moment he walked through the door with Whitfield at his side, and Charlotte, composed and immaculate, seated in the front row of onlookers. Josiah Carter looked older than Nathaniel remembered, harder around the eyes, dressed in clothes too fine for a man claiming honest grievance rather than calculated opportunism. He offered Nathaniel a thin, humorless smile as the proceedings began, the smile of a man who believed quite thoroughly that he'd already won. The magistrate, not the corrupt figure Nathaniel had half feared, given how easily records seemed to have gone missing, but a stern-weathered man named Judge Allwood, who clearly took a dim view of frivolous land disputes, clogging his docket, called the hearing to order with brisk efficiency. Josiah's lawyer spoke first, laying out the claim in careful, practiced language, painting a picture of an old surveying error, an injustice, 30 years overdue for correction, a family estate wrongfully divided by a mistake in decades-old paperwork. It was, Nathaniel had to admit, a persuasive performance delivered with the kind of confident polish that made even a baseless claim sound reasonable. Then Whitfield rose, and with quiet, devastating precision produced the settlement record Nathaniel had found buried in the county archive, walking the court through its provenance, its seal, its unmistakable resolution of the very boundary dispute Josiah now claimed had never been settled at all. A murmur ran through the courtroom as the document was read aloud. Josiah's expression, for the first time since the hearing began, flickered with something less than confidence. "Your Honor," Josiah's lawyer objected. "This document's authenticity has not been—" "This document," Judge Allwood interrupted, examining it himself over the rims of his spectacles, "bears the seal of Magistrate Elias Thorne, whose signature I have seen on a dozen other records from this very period, and which matches perfectly. I see no grounds to question its authenticity. Counselor, unless you're prepared to argue that a 31-year-old settlement record filed properly, and now entered into evidence, ought to be disregarded simply because it's inconvenient to your client's claim." The courtroom's mood shifted palpably, and Nathaniel felt for the first time since the summons had arrived something like real hope taking hold. But Josiah wasn't finished. He rose himself before his own lawyer could stop him, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the desperation underneath. "Your Honor, whatever this document says, the fact remains that this household has fallen into visible disarray. Nathaniel Carter's own wife abandoned this home weeks ago in full view of the county, and a man who cannot hold his own marriage together can hardly be trusted to manage an estate of this size responsibly. I would submit that regardless of the boundary question, the court ought to consider whether this land wouldn't be better served under more stable management." It was a naked, desperate gambit, and Nathaniel felt his stomach drop because there was nothing in the settlement record that could answer an accusation like that. Nothing that could undo the very real, very public fact of Charlotte's departure. It was Charlotte herself who rose before anyone else could respond. "Your Honor, if I might address the court directly." Judge Allwood, visibly surprised, gestured for her to proceed. "You are Mrs. Carter, I take it?" "I am." Charlotte stood tall, her voice carrying clear and steady through the hushed courtroom, and Nathaniel watched her with something like awe, because he had never once in 10 years seen her command a room the way she commanded this one now. "Mr. Josiah Carter suggests that my husband is unfit to manage this land, because our marriage has faced difficulty this past month. I would ask the court to consider what relevance a private matter between husband and wife has to a legal question of surveyed boundaries and decades-old settlement records." "None whatsoever, generally speaking," Judge Allwood agreed, "though your cousin-in-law has seen fit to raise it, Mrs. Carter, so I'll allow you to speak to it if you wish. Then I will say this plainly." Charlotte's gaze swept the courtroom before settling briefly on Nathaniel himself. "Every marriage endures its private struggles, Your Honor. Mine is no exception, and I'll not stand here and pretend otherwise for the sake of appearances. But whatever difficulties my husband and I have faced, they have nothing whatsoever to do with his capability to manage this estate, an estate which, I might add, I myself helped manage for the better part of a decade, and which I can testify has been kept honestly, responsibly, and in full accordance with the law throughout every year of our marriage. Mr. Josiah Carter's attempt to use my personal circumstances as evidence of my husband's unfitness is not merely irrelevant, Your Honor. It is, I would suggest, a rather transparent attempt to distract this court from the fact that his claim on the merits has just been thoroughly and permanently discredited." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Allwood had to rap his gavel twice to restore order, though Nathaniel thought he detected beneath the judge's stern exterior something almost like approval. "Well said, Mrs. Carter." Judge Allwood turned his attention back to Josiah, whose face had gone pale and tight. "Mr. Carter, in light of the settlement record entered into evidence today, and finding no merit whatsoever in your attempt to introduce irrelevant personal matters as grounds for reconsidering established title, this court finds in favor of the defendant. The boundary stands as surveyed and settled 31 years ago. Your claim is dismissed in full, and I would caution you, sir, against bringing frivolous matters before this court again, lest you find yourself facing consequences considerably less forgiving than dismissal." The gavel came down with a sharp final crack, and the courtroom broke into a wave of murmured conversation. Some of it sympathetic to Nathaniel, some clearly disappointed that the spectacle hadn't run longer. Josiah Carter gathered his papers with stiff, furious movements and left without a backward glance, his lawyer trailing behind him with an expression of barely concealed embarrassment. Nathaniel turned to find Charlotte already watching him, her composure once more intact, though something in her eyes suggested the effort of maintaining it had cost her more than she wanted to show. "Thank you." He said the words, feeling wholly inadequate to the moment. "You didn't have to do that." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." "Why did you—" Charlotte was quiet a moment, and around them the courtroom continued to empty county neighbors, offering Nathaniel handshakes, and murmured congratulations that he barely registered his attention, entirely fixed on the woman in front of him. "Because it was right," she said finally. "And because I'll not let a man like Josiah Carter win by exploiting my own pain as a weapon. That has nothing to do with you, Nathaniel. That's simply who I am." "I know that now," he said quietly. "I only wish I'd known it years ago." Something passed across her face, brief and unguarded, before the careful composure settled back into place. "The land is safe. That's what matters today." She began to turn away, and Nathaniel, driven by some desperate impulse he couldn't quite contain, reached out, not touching her, just a gesture, a plea. "Charlotte, please. Just a few more minutes. I need to ask you something, and I don't think I can wait any longer to ask it." She hesitated, then nodded once, stepping aside from the thinning crowd toward a quieter corner of the courthouse steps. "Ask then. Come home." The words tumbled out rougher and more desperate than he intended, but he pressed on before he lost his nerve entirely. "Not because you have to, not because anything's owed to me. I know nothing's owed to me. But because I have spent the last month learning who you truly are, Charlotte, and I cannot bear the thought of spending the rest of my life only knowing the shape of you from a distance. I want another chance. I know I don't deserve one. I'm asking anyway." For a long, terrible moment, Charlotte said nothing at all, and Nathaniel watched her face for some sign of what she was feeling. Finding only that same careful stillness she'd worn the morning she left him. The stillness of a woman who had learned over 10 long years to keep her truest feelings locked, somewhere he couldn't reach. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it landed with the weight of a verdict far more final than anything Judge Allwood had delivered that morning. "An apology cannot erase 10 years of silence, Nathaniel. 10 years of being seen and not truly looked at. 10 years of pouring your coffee and refilling your cup and managing your household while an entire second life grew inside me that you never once thought to ask about." Her voice trembled just slightly, the first real crack he'd seen in her composure since the town hall. "You want to know the tragedy of it? It was never that you failed to love me enough. Love, I think, you might have managed in your own limited way if you'd only ever bothered to try. The tragedy is that you never once truly looked at me. Not until I was already gone." "I'm looking now," he said, his own voice breaking on the words. "I'm looking, Charlotte, and I swear to you, I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that I mean it." "I believe that you believe that," she said softly, and there was something almost like grief in her expression. Now grief for something neither of them could quite name. "But belief isn't the same as certainty. Nathaniel and I have given this marriage 10 years of my belief already. I don't know that I have another 10 to spare, on the chance that this time might be different." She stepped back from him, then putting distance between them that felt to Nathaniel far more absolute than the physical space of a few feet. "The Boston exhibition is in 11 days, she said, her composure reasserting itself, even as her eyes remained bright with unshed tears. "I'll be gone for several months preparing for it, possibly longer, if the reception is what Rebecca believes it will be. I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because you deserve to know where I stand plainly, the same courtesy I've been trying to extend you since the day I left. Charlotte." "Goodbye, Nathaniel." She turned and walked down the courthouse steps, and this time he did not follow because some hard, honest part of him understood that following her, now pushing further when she had just given him her answer, as clearly as she knew how, would only prove every doubt she'd just voiced about whether he had truly learned to look at her at all. He stood alone on those courthouse steps for a long while after she'd disappeared from view. the summer sun beating down without mercy. The weight of the morning's victory, feeling suddenly hollow and insignificant against the far greater loss he'd just watched walk away from him. He had saved the land. He had not. It seemed saved his marriage, and standing there in the aftermath of both, Nathaniel Carter understood with a clarity that felt almost unbearable that the harder battle, the one that actually mattered, was only just beginning, and that no courtroom victory, however sweet, could substitute for the long, patient, unglamorous work of proving to Charlotte Brooks that he had finally truly learned to see her. 11 days. That was what Charlotte had given him, and Nathaniel spent the first 3 of them simply standing in the wreckage of what he'd built and what he'd lost, unable to decide which mattered more, or whether the question even made sense anymore. It was Whitfield of all people who shook him out of it. "You won your case, Mr. Carter," the lawyer said, arriving unannounced on the 4th morning to deliver the final court paperwork, finding Nathaniel sitting at his kitchen table staring at nothing in particular. "You look like a man who lost everything he owns." "I did lose something. Just not the land." Whitfield studied him a long moment, then set the paperwork down and pulled out the chair across from him uninvited. "May I speak plainly, Mr. Carter, outside the bounds of what you're paying me for?" "Go ahead. I've represented a great many men in this county over the years, and I've learned to recognize the difference between a man who's lost something and a man who's simply waiting for permission to go get it back." Whitfield tapped the table once firm. "Your wife told you an apology cannot erase 10 years of silence. She's right. But I'd wager she didn't tell you there was nothing you could do about it. She told you belief isn't certainty. That's not a door closing, Mr. Carter. That's a door left open by half an inch for a man patient enough to prove himself worthy of walking through it properly." Nathaniel looked up. "She's leaving for Boston in a week. Then you'd best figure out quickly what a man does with 11 days when pleading and grand gestures have already failed him." Whitfield rose, gathering his coat. "In my experience, it's never the speech that wins a woman back, Mr. Carter. It's what a man does on the ordinary Tuesday after the speech when nobody's watching, and there's no audience left to perform for." He left Nathaniel alone with that thought, and it settled into him slowly, like water finding the cracks in stone. He thought of Samuel's warning in the barn, "Show her, not tell her." He thought of Sarah Bennett's words in her garden weeks before, "Look at your own house." He thought of every scrap of counsel he'd been handed over the past month, all of it pointing toward the same hard truth that whatever he did next could not be for Charlotte's benefit, alone could not be a performance staged for her eventual approval. It had to be real. It had to hold up whether she was there to see it or not. So he began where he should have begun a decade ago. He began with the ledger. He sat down that same evening with Charlotte's green household book, and rather than simply reading it for clues, this time he tried to understand it. Truly understand it, the rhythm of it, the way she'd tracked seed costs against the season's rainfall, the careful notation beside every supplier's name, marking not just what was owed, but when that particular man's wife had been unwell, when a payment might need to come early out of simple kindness. It wasn't just bookkeeping. It was a map of an entire community that Charlotte had quietly tended for 10 years, while Nathaniel rode past all of it without seeing. By the second day, he'd taught himself enough of her system to catch an error he'd made in his own hasty accounting since she'd left a payment to the miller, recorded twice another to the smith missed entirely. He rode into town that same afternoon to correct it personally, and found himself without quite planning to sitting across from the smith's wife for the better part of an hour, listening to her talk about her husband's bad hip and how Charlotte used to bring over liniment every few weeks without ever once being asked. "She never made a show of it," the woman said, working a piece of mending in her lap. "Just showed up with a jar, said it was extra from her own supply, never once let on she'd gone out of her way to make more than she needed." Nathaniel rode home with that story sitting heavy and warm in his chest, one more small piece of the wife he'd never known, assembling itself into a fuller picture. And he made a note, an actual note in his own hand, in a book he'd started keeping for exactly this purpose, to have liniment sent to the smith's house the following week. Not because Charlotte would ever know of it, but because it was He was beginning to understand. Simply the right thing to do for a man who'd been quietly cared for and deserved to keep being cared for. That was the first mini victory, small as it was, and it cracked something open in him that the following days only widened further. On the 5th day, Samuel appeared again, though this time there was no hostility in his bearing at all, only a kind of careful, watchful curiosity. "Word around town is you've been paying old debts nobody asked you to pay," Samuel said, leaning against the porch post while Nathaniel worked through a stack of correspondence Charlotte had left half-answered. "Widow Hutchins says you settled an account she didn't even know was overdue." It was overdue. Charlotte's ledger just never pressed anyone too hard for it. Ward. That sounds like her. Samuel was quiet a moment, studying Nathaniel with something that might have been the beginning of reluctant respect. "You know she's not going to hear about any of this from me. I'm not carrying tales back and forth like some errand boy. I don't want you to." Nathaniel set down the letter he'd been reading. "I'm not doing this so word gets back to her, Samuel. I'm doing it because I finally understand what she was carrying all these years, and somebody ought to keep carrying it properly now that she's not here to." Something in Samuel's face shifted just slightly. "That's a different answer than I expected from you a month back. I'm a different man than I was a month back. Whether that matters to anyone but me remains to be seen." Samuel nodded slowly, and for the first time since Nathaniel had known him, there was no edge in it at all. "Keep at it," he said simply, and rode off without further comment, leaving Nathaniel with the distinct sense that he'd just cleared some small unspoken test. The 6th day brought a different kind of test entirely. One that arrived in the form of a letter from Josiah Carter, delivered by a boy who clearly wanted no part of whatever business had sent him, and disappeared down the lane the moment the letter changed hands. Nathaniel opened it standing in his own yard and felt his jaw tighten with every line. Josiah had not apparently accepted his courtroom defeat with any real grace. The letter was full of thinly veiled threats, dressed up as cordial correspondence mentions of further avenues, still available to a man of his standing. References to certain irregularities he claimed to have discovered in the estate's tax filings over the years, a none too subtle suggestion that Nathaniel might find life considerably easier if he simply agreed to sell off the disputed timber stand at a price Josiah considered fair, sparing them both the unpleasantness of continued legal wrangling. It was, Nathaniel understood immediately, nothing more than a bluff, dressed up in legal language, an attempt to extract through intimidation what the court had already refused to grant through law. But bluffs, he'd learned, could do real damage if left unanswered, and he had no intention of leaving this one unanswered. He rode straight to Whitfield's office. "He's grasping," Whitfield said, reading the letter with visible distaste. "There are no irregularities in your tax filings, Mr. Carter, not that I've seen in the course of preparing your case, and Josiah Carter has no more legal standing today than he did the moment Judge Allwood dismissed his claim. This is nothing but a man trying to save face after a public humiliation, hoping intimidation succeeds where legal argument failed. What do? We do nothing rash, and we do nothing that gives him grounds to claim harassment on his part. We respond in writing calmly, making clear that any further claims will be met with the same evidence that dismantled his first attempt, and that continued threats of this nature will be brought directly to Judge Allwood's attention, given his Honor's expressed opinion of frivolous matters cluttering his docket." Whitfield was already reaching for paper and ink. "I'll draft the response myself. You needn't dignify this with a personal reply." Nathaniel left that meeting with the immediate threat handled, but the encounter left a residue of unease that followed him home, a reminder that his victory in court, however satisfying, had not entirely closed the door on Josiah's resentment, and that some part of this fight might not be finished yet, whatever the paperwork said. He tried not to let it consume the work he'd set for himself, and mostly in the days that followed, he succeeded. By the 8th day, the household had begun to feel in small but unmistakable ways, less like a house in disarray and more like a home again. Not because Charlotte had returned to it, but because Nathaniel had finally started tending to it, the way she once had, quietly, consistently, without needing an audience to witness the effort. He'd taken to riding out to the tenant farms himself, now something he'd never once bothered doing in 10 years of ownership, always trusting a hired overseer to handle matters he'd considered beneath his direct attention. He found to his genuine surprise that half the families working his land had stories about Charlotte that mirrored the Smith's wife's small kindnesses, quiet attentions, a woman who had apparently spent a decade being the true, unseen steward of everything Nathaniel had only ever claimed credit for owning. "She used to bring my youngest her old drawing paper," one tenant's wife told him standing in her doorway with a baby on her hip. "Said it was scraps wasn't fit for her own work anymore, though I always suspected she cut good paper down special just so the girl wouldn't feel like she was taking charity." Nathaniel found himself more than once during these visits having to turn away and collect himself before he trusted his voice again. It was on the 9th day, with only 2 remaining before Charlotte's departure for Boston, that Sarah Bennet appeared at his gate once more, this time without any pretense of a chance encounter. "I've been hearing things," she said, without any greeting at all, studying him with the same sharp assessment she'd leveled at him the very first time he'd come asking after Charlotte. "About debts settled. About a man riding out to tenant farms he's never once visited in 10 years of owning them. Word travels fast in this county. It does when the story's worth telling." Sarah's expression for the first time since Nathaniel had known her softened into something almost approving. "I'll tell you plainly. Mr. Carter, I didn't think you had it in you. Most men faced with what you've faced this past month would have spent it drinking and feeling sorry for themselves, or worse, spent it trying to convince the whole county that Charlotte was the one at fault for leaving. You've done neither. It's not for show, Mrs. Bennet. I know that. That's precisely why I'm standing at your gate telling you so." She studied him a moment longer. "Charlotte leaves for Boston in 2 days. Are you going to let her go without saying anything more than you've already said?" "I already asked her to come home. She gave me her answer. She gave you an honest answer to a question asked too soon, before you'd done anything to earn a different one." Sarah's voice was firm, almost impatient. "You're not thinking about this the right way, Nathaniel. This isn't about convincing her to stay. She has an exhibition in Boston that matters more to her than anything you or I could offer her right now, and rightly so after everything she sacrificed to build it. The question isn't whether you can talk her out of going. The question is whether you're willing to let her go and keep doing exactly what you've been doing this past week without demanding anything in return for as long as it takes." Nathaniel absorbed that in silence, the weight of it settling somewhere deep. "That could be months," he said finally. "Longer. It could be years if that's what honest change requires." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "You want an easy answer, Mr. Carter? You've come to the wrong woman. I buried a husband I loved dearly, and I'll tell you, love that only shows up when it's convenient isn't love worth having. If you mean what you've been doing this past week, you'll keep doing it whether Charlotte's watching from across the room or 300 miles away in Boston. That's the only proof that means anything." She left him with that, and Nathaniel spent the rest of that day turning her words over, understanding slowly that Sarah was right. That whatever came next could not hinge on Charlotte's presence or absence, could not be contingent on winning her back within some arbitrary window of 11 days that had in truth never been a deadline at all, only a date on a calendar marking when she'd leave, not when his chance to prove himself would end. So, on the 10th day, he did something he hadn't planned, something that came to him almost without conscious decision, the way the truest impulses sometimes do. He went to Rebecca Hale's print shop, not to ask after Charlotte, not to plead for information he had no right to, but to ask Rebecca a question that had been sitting in his chest for days. "I want to understand her work properly," he said, once the bell above the door had settled. "Not just admire it from a distance the way I did at the town hall. I want to understand what she's actually doing, the skill of it, so that if I'm ever fortunate enough to speak with her again about her art, I'm not simply offering empty compliments a stranger might give." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing something. "That's an unusual request, Mr. Carter. I've made a great many unusual choices this past month. I don't see why this one shouldn't join them." Something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across Rebecca's sharp features, and she gestured him toward the work table near the window. "Sit then. I'll show you what I can, though I warn you, it's taken Charlotte years to master what I can explain to you in an afternoon." She spent the better part of 2 hours walking him through the fundamentals, how pigment behaved differently on paper, depending on the season a specimen was gathered. Why Charlotte insisted on sketching directly from living plants, rather than working from pressed or dried specimens. The way lesser illustrators often did, the painstaking process of matching color while a bloom was still fresh before it faded into something false. Nathaniel listened with an attention he realized partway through. He had never once given anything in his adult life that wasn't directly tied to his own immediate interests. "She sees things most people walk right past," Rebecca said near the end, gathering the materials back into their proper places. "That's the heart of what makes her work exceptional, Mr. Carter. Not just skill of hand, though she has that in abundance. It's attention. Genuine, patient attention to something the rest of the world considers ordinary enough to ignore." Nathaniel absorbed that with a quiet, aching recognition, understanding all too well the parallel Rebecca hadn't bothered to state outright. "Thank you," he said, rising to leave, "for teaching me this." "Don't thank me yet." Rebecca walked him to the door, her expression unreadable. "Charlotte leaves for Boston tomorrow morning. Whatever you've learned here, Mr. Carter, I hope you find a way to use it that doesn't simply amount to fine words meant to win her back. She's had enough of men's fine words to last her a lifetime." Charlotte left for Boston the following morning, and Nathaniel did not ride out to see her off, did not send flowers or letters or any of the grand, desperate gestures some lesser version of himself might have attempted a month earlier. Instead, he stayed at the estate and kept working exactly as he'd resolved, to understanding now that the truest test of everything he'd learned would come not in the 11 days he'd been given, but in the long, unglamorous months that followed, when there was no deadline left to race against and no audience left to perform for. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Nathaniel had never once known in 10 years of marriage. A rhythm of consistent, quiet labor that asked nothing in return. He kept the ledger himself now in Charlotte's careful method, tracking not just what was owed, but who among his tenants and suppliers might need a kindness extended before they ever thought to ask for one. He rode out to the farms regularly, not as an absentee landlord collecting what was due, but as a man genuinely invested in the people whose labor sustained the very land he'd nearly lost to his cousin's greed. He wrote to Charlotte exactly once during that first month, and he labored over the letter longer than he'd labored over anything in years, tearing up 3 drafts before he settled on one that felt honest rather than performative. He did not ask her to come home. He did not profess undying love or beg forgiveness. He simply told her plainly about the smith's wife, and the liniment about the tenant family, and the drawing paper about the small, unglamorous work of learning to see a household the way she had always seen it. He told her the northern pasture's fence had finally been properly repaired permanently this time, not the temporary patch job he'd promised the Hendricks boy weeks and weeks ago. He told her Josiah had gone quiet since Whitfield's response, though Nathaniel remained watchful all the same. He asked for nothing in reply, made clear he expected nothing in reply, and closed simply by saying he hoped Boston was treating her work with the respect it had always deserved. Her response when it came nearly 3 weeks later was brief, but Nathaniel read it so many times the paper began to soften at its folds. She wrote that the exhibition preparations were consuming nearly every waking hour, that Rebecca's contacts in Boston had proven even more influential than expected, that a naturalist of some real standing had expressed interest in commissioning an entire series based on her early sketches. She wrote almost as an afterthought that she was glad to hear the fence had finally been properly mended. She signed it simply, Charlotte, nothing more. No closing sentiment, either warm or cold. And Nathaniel understood reading it that this was not an invitation to write more urgently or press harder. It was simply an acknowledgement that his letter had been received, and perhaps if he read carefully enough between its careful spare lines, a small sign that the door Whitfield had spoken of remained open, however slightly. He wrote again a month later with the same restraint, the same absence of pleading. He told her about a widow 3 farms over whose roof had partially collapsed in a storm, and how he'd organized the tenants to help rebuild it, rather than simply sending coin and calling his obligation discharged the way his father always had. He told her he'd started keeping a second ledger separate from the household accounts, tracking small acts of care, the way her green book once had, not because he expected credit for it, but because he'd finally understood that this was what running an estate properly actually meant, not merely extracting value from land and tenants, but tending to the whole living fabric of a community. Her reply this time was longer, warmer, in ways that made his chest ache with a hope he tried not entirely successfully to keep in check. She described the exhibition hall being prepared for her work, the nervous excitement of seeing her illustrations matted and framed at a scale she'd never before been afforded, the strange, disorienting thrill of naturalists addressing her directly as Mrs. Carter, rather than the anonymous initials she'd hidden behind for 2 years. She mentioned briefly that Samuel had written to tell her about the tenant farms, about the widow's roof, and that she'd been surprised. Genuinely surprised, she admitted, by what he'd described. "I did not expect this," she wrote near the letter's close. "I do not know yet what to make of it, but I wanted you to know that I have noticed, even from this distance, and that noticing is not nothing whatever else remains unresolved between us." Nathaniel read those lines perhaps 20 times before he trusted himself to fold the letter away, and for the first time since the courthouse steps, he allowed himself to feel something that might cautiously be called hope. The third month brought its own trial, one Nathaniel hadn't anticipated and very nearly wasn't prepared for. Josiah Carter apparently unwilling to accept the quiet defeat. Whitfield's firm letter had seemingly secured, resurfaced with a different tactic entirely. Not another legal claim, since the court had made clear it would tolerate no further frivolous attempts. But a campaign of quiet, poisonous rumor spread through the county's taverns and church socials, suggesting that Nathaniel's newfound diligence toward his tenants was nothing more than a desperate performance staged to win back a wife who'd already made her true feelings plain by fleeing to Boston and showing no signs of returning. Word of it reached Nathaniel through Sarah Bennett, who arrived at his door one evening with her expression drawn tight with barely suppressed anger. "He's telling people you're a fraud," she said without preamble. "Says all this business with the tenants and the ledger is just a show that the moment Charlotte's finally settled somewhere else for good, you'll drop the pretense entirely and go right back to being the man who barely noticed his own wife's existence." Nathaniel felt something cold and furious settle in his chest, though beneath the anger, a quieter, more unsettling fear took root as well. The fear that Josiah's poison, however baseless, might somehow find its way to Boston, might somehow reach Charlotte and plant doubt in ground that had only just begun tentatively to soften. "What do I do?" "You do exactly what you've been doing," Sarah said firmly. "You don't dignify his lies with a public argument because arguing with a liar in a tavern only gives his lies more air to breathe. You keep tending your tenants. You keep answering Charlotte's letters honestly. You let your actions be loud enough that Josiah's whispers can't compete with them, and in time, this county will draw its own conclusions, same as it always does." It was. Nathaniel understood exactly the counsel Whitfield had given him weeks before, echoed now by a woman who had watched this entire transformation unfold with a skeptic's careful eye and had apparently come to believe in it enough to defend it. That mattered to him more than he expected. He kept to Sarah's advice, though the following weeks tested his patience more than once, particularly when word reached him that Josiah had taken his rumors as far as a letter addressed apparently to a mutual acquaintance in Boston, someone connected to the very circle of naturalists and publishers now championing Charlotte's work. Nathaniel learned of this development from an unexpected source, a brief, uncharacteristically urgent letter from Charlotte herself arriving faster than her usual correspondence, her handwriting slightly less composed than he'd come to recognize in her previous replies. "Someone here received a letter from your cousin," she wrote. "I will not dignify its contents by repeating them, save to say that he painted a portrait of you and of this household that I did not recognize. I told the gentleman plainly that Josiah Carter's account bore no resemblance to the man who has spent the past 3 months writing to me honestly about tenant farms and mended fences, and that if he wished to judge your character, he would do better to ask the families you have actually helped than a bitter relation with a grudge and a failed lawsuit behind him. I do not know why I felt compelled to defend you so readily. I am still turning that over in my own mind." Nathaniel read that letter with his heart hammering, understanding that Charlotte had, without any prompting from him, stood up on his behalf to a stranger in Boston, exactly as she had once stood up for him before Judge Allwood. Not because she owed him anything, but because apparently some part of her had already begun to believe in the change she was witnessing from 300 miles away. He wrote back that same night, restraining himself from saying too much, from pushing the moment further than it had earned the right to be pushed. He thanked her, simply told her Josiah's rumors had done no real damage in the county itself, that Sarah Bennett and Samuel and even Rebecca had all in their own ways stood firm against them. He did not ask what her defense of him meant, did not press her to examine her own feelings on his behalf. He simply thanked her and closed the letter, and trusted that restraint would say more than any declaration could have. By the 4th month, the exhibition itself finally approached, and Charlotte's letters grew shorter, more distracted, filled with the understandable anxiety of a woman on the verge of the greatest professional moment of her life. Nathaniel understood, reading between those increasingly hurried lines, that this was not the time to press for anything more than he'd already been given, and so he simply continued the quiet work he'd committed himself to, writing when he had something genuine to share, saying nothing when he didn't, and trusting that the months of consistent, unglamorous effort had built something sturdier than any single dramatic gesture ever could have. It was Samuel, in the end, who delivered the news that shifted everything once more. He arrived at Carter Manor on a bright autumn afternoon, dismounting with none of the old hostility Nathaniel remembered from their first encounter by the north pasture fence, and stood in the yard with an expression that Nathaniel had learned by now to read as cautiously significant. "The exhibition's in 10 days, Samuel said. "Boston. Charlotte's asked me to pass along an invitation, though she made me swear I'd deliver it exactly as she worded it, not softened, not embellished." Nathaniel's heart began pounding. What did she say? Samuel produced a folded letter from his coat, Charlotte's careful hand, visible even from a distance, and handed it over without further preamble. Nathaniel unfolded it with hands that weren't entirely steady, and read the words that would determine he understood immediately everything that came next. "You asked me once to come home," Charlotte had written, "and I told you an apology could not undo 10 years of silence. I still believe that. But these past 4 months I have watched a man I thought I knew completely reveal himself to be someone I never once had the chance to meet. During our marriage, a man who tends to tenant farms and settles quiet debts and defends nothing but simply does the work day after day, whether anyone is watching or not. I do not know yet what that means for us, Nathaniel. I am not offering you certainty because I do not have it to give. But I am asking you to come to Boston to attend this exhibition, not as my husband seeking reconciliation, but as a man who has finally learned to see what I have built. Come and see it for what it truly is. What happens after that I cannot yet say, but I find to my own surprise that I want you there." Nathaniel stood in his own yard with that letter trembling slightly in his grip, and felt something crack open in his chest that had been held tight and guarded for 4 long, uncertain months. "She means it," Samuel said quietly, watching Nathaniel's face. "I've never known my sister to write words she didn't mean, plain as that might sound." "I'll be there," Nathaniel said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Tell her I'll be there." Samuel studied him a moment longer, and then, for the first time since Nathaniel had known him, extended his hand. "Don't waste what these 4 months have built, Nathaniel," he said as they shook. "My sister's given you a door. Walking through it properly is still entirely up to you." Nathaniel rode into town that same afternoon, his mind already turning toward Boston, toward the exhibition, toward whatever remained unresolved between himself and the woman who had, against every reasonable expectation, just asked him to come and finally truly see her. The road to Boston took the better part of 3 days, and Nathaniel spent every mile of it turning Charlotte's letter over in his mind, until the paper had gone soft as cloth in his coat pocket. He did not know precisely what he would find when he arrived. He only knew that 4 months of quiet, unglamorous work had earned him this much: a door left open, however uncertain what lay beyond it, and he intended to walk through it as the man those 4 months had made him, not the man who'd once told his wife her face made him sick to look at. He took a room at a modest inn near the harbor and spent his first evening in the city doing something that surprised even himself. Rather than seeking Charlotte out immediately, rather than pressing his advantage, while his nerve still held, he sat down and wrote her a short note delivered by the innkeeper's boy, asking nothing more than whether she might permit him to call on her the following morning, at whatever hour suited her, and making plain that he would understand entirely if she preferred he simply attend the exhibition itself and nothing more. Her reply came within the hour, brief and to the point. 10 o'clock. Rebecca's shop has a Boston office near the print district. I will meet you there. He arrived the next morning nearly half an hour early, pacing the street outside the modest brick building until the appointed hour. His stomach knotted tighter than it had been even on the courthouse steps months before. When Charlotte finally appeared, stepping out from the doorway in a traveling dress of deep green, her hair pinned back in the practical style she favored for working days, Nathaniel found himself for one long moment entirely unable to speak. She looked different. Not older, not changed in any way he could point to plainly, but settled somehow, the way a person looks when they have finally stopped holding their breath. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "You did." She studied him a long moment, and Nathaniel forced himself to hold still under that scrutiny, to let her look as long and as carefully as she needed to. "Walk with me. There's a park nearby. I think more clearly outdoors than shut up in some office." They walked in silence for the first several minutes, and Nathaniel resisted every urge to fill that silence with nervous chatter, understanding from 4 months of restraint that some things were better left to unfold at their own pace. "The exhibition opens in 2 days, Charlotte said finally. "I confess I am more nervous than I expected to be. Rebecca says that's natural. I keep waiting to believe her. You've earned every bit of the reception you're about to receive, Charlotte. Whatever nerves you're carrying, they have nothing to do with the quality of the work. You sound very certain of that for a man who only saw a handful of my drawings some months back." "I sound certain because Rebecca spent an entire afternoon teaching me what I was actually looking at back before you left. I asked her to because I didn't want to stand in front of your work again and only be able to offer some empty compliment a stranger might give a painting he didn't understand." Nathaniel kept his eyes forward, giving her space to absorb that without the pressure of his gaze. "I wanted to understand it properly. I think I do now, at least well enough to know that what you've built is extraordinary, and that the only tragedy in any of this was that it took me so long to bother finding out." Charlotte was quiet for a long stretch after that, her steps slowing slightly, and when Nathaniel glanced over, he found her blinking hard, her composure working overtime against something that threatened to break through it. "Samuel showed me a letter," she said eventually, her voice unsteady. "One you sent him some weeks back about the widow's roof. You didn't know he'd share it. You wrote it thinking no one but my brother would ever read it." "I remember it. You wrote that you'd finally understood what my father used to tell me growing up, that a community isn't a collection of transactions. It's a collection of people who choose again and again to notice each other." Her voice caught. "I didn't know you'd ever spoken with my father long enough to hear him say that." "I hadn't, not directly. Samuel told me once when he was still deciding whether to trust me even an inch. I don't think he meant it as a lesson at the time. It became one anyway." They walked in silence again longer this time, and Nathaniel let it stretch, understanding that Charlotte was working through something private, something that didn't require his input to resolve itself. "I have spent 4 months," she said finally, "reading your letters and telling myself not to hope too much. Telling myself that consistency over a season is not the same as consistency over a lifetime, that anyone can maintain a performance for a few months if the stakes feel high enough." "That's fair. But then Samuel's letter arrived, the one about the roof, and I realized you weren't performing for me at all in that letter. You didn't even know he'd share it. And I understood reading it that whatever this is, you've become these past months, it isn't for my benefit. It's simply who you've decided to be." She stopped walking entirely now, turning to face him fully. "That frightens me more than anything else could, Nathaniel, because it means I no longer have a clean reason to keep my guard up." "I don't want your guard up, Charlotte. I never should have given you reason to raise it in the first place." "No," she agreed softly. "You shouldn't have." She held his gaze a long moment, something unguarded finally surfacing in her expression. "I'm not offering you certainty. I want that understood plainly, same as I told you on the courthouse steps. I don't know what happens after this exhibition, after I return home, if I return home. But I find I no longer want to keep you at the distance I've been keeping you at. That's the most honest thing I can offer you right now. It's more than enough," Nathaniel said, his voice thick. "It's more than I had any right to hope for." The 2 days before the exhibition passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Nathaniel giving Charlotte the space she needed to prepare, while making himself useful in whatever small ways she'd permit, carrying crates of framed work to Rebecca's Boston office, fetching correspondence from publishers eager to view the collection, early running errands that required nothing more of him than steady hands and a willingness to be helpful without expecting credit for it. It was on the second evening, the night before the exhibition itself, that trouble found them again, and this time it arrived in a form neither of them had anticipated. Rebecca appeared at the inn where Nathaniel was staying, her expression tight with barely contained fury, a folded newspaper clutched in her hand. "You need to see this," she said, pushing past him into the small common room without waiting for an invitation. "Both of you need to see this. Where's Charlotte? She's finishing preparations at the exhibition hall. What's happened?" Rebecca unfolded the newspaper and slapped it down on the nearest table, jabbing a finger at a column near the bottom of the page. "Your cousin has friends in this city, Nathaniel, or at least friends willing to take his coin." This ran in this evening's edition. Nathaniel read the column with mounting horror. It was a thinly veiled piece of gossip journalism, unsigned, suggesting that the botanical illustrator known as C. Brooks was in fact the estranged wife of a New England landowner currently embroiled in a family lawsuit over disputed property, and questioning whether the sudden interest in her work from Boston's naturalist community owed more to sympathy for her personal circumstances than genuine artistic merit. A scandal dressed up as concerned journalism, designed to poison the exhibition before it had even opened its doors. "This is Josiah's doing," Nathaniel said, his hands tightening on the paper until it crumpled at the edges. "He's trying to reach her here exactly the way he tried reaching that naturalist a few months back. He's trying to undermine everything she's built. Whether it's Josiah directly or some rival in the trade taking advantage of an easy target, the damage is the same," Rebecca said grimly. "If this circulates before tomorrow's opening, it could color how every guest walks through those doors. People don't come to view fine art with an open mind when they've just read gossip suggesting the whole thing is built on sympathy rather than talent." "Does Charlotte know?" "Not yet. I came here first, hoping we might find some way to blunt this before it reaches her tonight, the evening before the most important day of her career." Rebecca's jaw was tight. "I don't know that there's anything to be done about a printed column already circulating, Nathaniel. But I thought you deserved the chance to decide how she hears about it, rather than stumbling onto it herself in some stranger's hands tomorrow morning." Nathaniel felt the old familiar anger rising hot and dangerous, the same anger that had once driven him to dismiss things too quickly to act before he'd properly thought a matter through. But 4 months of careful, deliberate work had taught him something about patience that the old Nathaniel had never possessed, and he forced himself with real effort to think clearly rather than react. "I'll tell her myself," he said finally. "Tonight. She deserves to hear it from someone who cares about her, not stumble onto it cold, and she deserves the chance to decide how she wants to respond, rather than have that decision made for her by people trying to protect her feelings." He found Charlotte at the exhibition hall an hour later, arranging the final placement of her illustrations with the meticulous care of a woman who understood exactly how much rested on getting every detail right. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting immediately to concern at whatever she read on his face. "What's happened?" He told her plainly without softening it, laying the newspaper column out for her to read herself, rather than paraphrasing it in some gentler version that might leave her feeling managed or protected from the truth. Charlotte read it in silence, her face going through a rapid succession of emotions, shock, then anger, then something more controlled and calculating that Nathaniel recognized with a small flicker of pride as the same steel she'd shown in that courtroom months before. "Josiah," she said finally, not a question. "I believe so. Rebecca suspects the same. Of course he would. Charlotte set the paper down with deliberate calm, though her hands weren't entirely steady. He couldn't win in court, so now he's trying to win by making certain nobody takes my work seriously enough to matter. Attack the art through the artist's private life, since he found no purchase attacking the land through legal argument. What do you want to do? Charlotte was quiet a long moment, staring at the illustrations arranged around her, each one representing months, years of careful patient work that no amount of gossip could actually diminish, however much it might color a first impression. I want to answer it, she said finally, something hardening in her voice. Not by hiding from it, not by pretending it doesn't exist. I want to stand in front of every guest who walks through that door tomorrow and let my work speak for itself. And if anyone raises the question directly, I intend to answer it honestly, without shame, because I have done nothing in this entire affair to be ashamed of. That takes considerable courage. It takes considerably less courage than what I've already survived this past year. She looked at him directly. I left a marriage that had made me invisible for a decade, Nathaniel. I built an entire career under a false name because I feared what the truth might cost me. I stood in a courtroom and defended a man I wasn't certain I still loved because it was the right thing to do. After all of that, I am not about to let some coward's newspaper column decide how I walk into my own exhibition. Nathaniel felt something fierce and proud swell in his chest watching her. Then I'll stand beside you tomorrow if you'll have me. Not to speak for you, just so you know you're not facing it alone. Charlotte studied him a long moment, and something in her expression softened just slightly at the edges. I'd like that, she said quietly. I find to my own surprise that I would. Sure. The exhibition hall was already filling by the time the doors opened the following afternoon. A crowd larger and more distinguished than Nathaniel had anticipated publishers and naturalists and society figures moving through the space with the particular hush of people who understood they were witnessing something significant, whatever gossip might have reached their ears the night before. Nathaniel stood near the entrance for the first hour watching Charlotte move through the crowd with a composure that struck him as almost unbelievable, given everything she was carrying beneath it. She answered questions about her technique with the same warmth and precision he'd seen at the town hall showing months before. And when, inevitably, one guest, an older gentleman with a pointed, curious expression, raised the subject of the newspaper column directly, Charlotte did not flinch. I understand there's been some talk, the gentleman said, not unkindly, but clearly testing the waters. About your personal circumstances. About whether they've influenced the interest in your work. I'd invite you to look at the work itself and decide for yourself, sir. Charlotte answered steady and clear enough that several nearby guests turned to listen. I have spent 2 years building a reputation under a name that concealed exactly who I was specifically, so that any interest in my illustrations would rest entirely on their merit, not on any sympathy my personal life might invite. If my identity as Mrs. Carter troubles you, I would ask only that you judge the botanical accuracy of the specimens in front of you. The precision of the pigment work, the scientific value, naturalists across 3 cities have already vouched for, and decide for yourself whether those things depend in any way on the state of my marriage. The gentleman studied her a long moment, then turned to examine the nearest illustration with new attention. And Nathaniel watched something shift in the man's expression, genuine appreciation, replacing whatever skepticism the gossip column had planted. Remarkable. The man murmured more to himself than to anyone else. Genuinely remarkable work, Mrs. Carter. I confess I came prepared to be unimpressed given what I'd read. I find myself thoroughly corrected. Charlotte's composure held, but Nathaniel saw the small private relief flicker across her face before she turned to greet the next guest, and he understood watching her that whatever damage Josiah had hoped to inflict had failed against the simple, undeniable quality of the work itself. It was perhaps 2 hours into the exhibition, the crowd at its thickest, when a commotion near the entrance drew Nathaniel's attention, and his stomach dropped as he recognized the figure pushing his way through the gathered guests. Josiah Carter himself, apparently unwilling to let his newspaper gambit stand, as his final effort had come in person. "I want everyone here to understand exactly what they're looking at," Josiah announced, his voice pitched to carry, cutting through the polite murmur of the exhibition hall with deliberate cruelty. This woman abandoned her marriage, abandoned her husband's household in a state of disarray, and now stands here accepting your admiration while the man she left behind fights to hold his own land together. I'd ask you all to consider what kind of character that speaks to, whatever fine pictures she's managed to paint. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the hall guests, turning to stare, and Nathaniel felt his old anger surge dangerously close to the surface. Every instinct in him wanted to cross the room and physically remove his cousin from the building, to shout him down the way the old Nathaniel might have driven by pride rather than reason. But Charlotte moved first. She crossed the room with the same even unhurried steps she'd used to walk out of Carter Manor months before, and the crowd parted instinctively to let her pass, sensing that whatever was about to happen deserved witness rather than interruption. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady through the now silent hall. "I believe we've met, though I don't recall you ever once introducing yourself with any honesty about your intentions." Josiah's confidence flickered clearly, not having anticipated a direct confrontation from the very woman he'd come to shame. "I'm merely informing these good people. You're attempting to poison an exhibition you have no legitimate stake in." Charlotte cut him off, "because a court of law already rejected your attempt to steal land you had no legal claim to, and you've apparently decided that if you cannot win through honest means, you'll settle for cruelty instead." Her voice never rose, never wavered, and that steadiness seemed to unsettle Josiah far more than shouting could have. "You're correct that I left my marriage. I'll not deny that publicly, because I have nothing to be ashamed of in that choice. What you fail to mention, Mr. Carter, is that in the months since your cousin has spent every single day proving himself worthy of reconsideration, tending to tenants you never once cared for, settling debts you'd have let languish, becoming a man I no longer recognize as the one I left. You meanwhile have spent those same months filing false claims, spreading rumors, and now interrupting a woman's professional achievement out of nothing more than petty cowardly spite." The hall remained utterly silent, every guest transfixed, and Josiah's face had gone from confident red to pale, uncertain white. "These people deserve to know. These people deserve to judge my work on its merits, which is precisely what they've been doing for the past 2 hours quite successfully, until you burst in here determined to spoil it." Charlotte's gaze swept the room, taking in the assembled guests, before returning to Josiah with unmistakable finality. "I would ask you to leave, Mr. Carter. You have no legitimate business here, and your presence serves no purpose beyond confirming to everyone in this room exactly the character Judge Allwood already recognized when he dismissed your claim as frivolous and warned you against bringing further nonsense before his court." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and Nathaniel watched his cousin's composure crumble entirely under the weight of Charlotte's steady, unflinching rebuke. Josiah looked around the room, finding no sympathy anywhere in the assembled faces, and after a long, humiliating moment of silence, he turned and pushed his way back out through the doors he'd entered, through his retreat far less confident than his entrance had been. The room erupted into a wave of murmured conversation the moment the doors closed behind him and Nathaniel crossed to Charlotte's side, his heart still pounding with a mixture of fury and overwhelming pride. "You didn't need me at all," he said quietly once he'd reached her. "No." Charlotte agreed, though there was warmth in it now, not coldness. "But I'm glad you were here to see it anyway." The gentleman who'd questioned her earlier approached again, his expression now entirely reconstructed into open admiration. "Mrs. Carter, I don't believe I've ever witnessed a more thorough dismantling of an unwelcome guest. I confess my admiration for your work has only deepened watching you defend it so capably." Other guests followed his lead, and the remainder of the afternoon unfolded exactly as it should have from the start. Charlotte's illustrations drawing the attention and genuine acclaim they'd always deserved. Commissions discussed publishers making earnest inquiries. Naturalists praising the scientific precision of her work with an enthusiasm that left no room for lingering doubt about whether sympathy, rather than talent, had earned her this moment. By the exhibition's close that evening, word had already begun spreading through Boston's artistic and scientific circles that Charlotte Brooks Carter had produced not merely a fine collection of botanical studies, but one of the most significant contributions to American natural illustration in a generation. 3 days later, with the exhibition's success firmly established, and Josiah's humiliation having apparently reached even the ears of the county back home, judging by the letters of quiet satisfaction Sarah Bennett and Samuel both sent along, Nathaniel found himself once again walking beside Charlotte through the same Boston park where they'd first spoken honestly, months of uncertainty, finally settling into something clearer. "The publishers want a second series," Charlotte said, something like wonder still coloring her voice even days after the fact. "A full-commission native flora across the northeastern territories, enough work to occupy me for the better part of 2 years if I accept it fully." "Will you accept it?" "I intend to." She glanced at him, something careful in her expression. "That would mean considerable travel, Nathaniel. Months away from home at a time gathering specimens, working with naturalists across several states. It's not a small commitment. I wouldn't ask you to give it up, not for anything." Nathaniel meant it fully, without hesitation, and he saw something in Charlotte's face relax slightly at the certainty in his voice. "I spent 10 years failing to see the woman standing in front of me. I'm not about to spend whatever years remain to us asking that same woman to fold herself smaller so I can feel more comfortable." That's a very different answer than the man I married would have given. "I'm not entirely certain that man and I are the same person anymore," Nathaniel said quietly. "I've spent 4 months trying very hard to make sure of it." Charlotte stopped walking, turning to face him fully, and Nathaniel felt his heart climb into his throat under the weight of her scrutiny. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what a marriage might look like built properly this time. Not the one we had before where I disappeared into your household and called it duty. Something different. Equal, I think, is the word I keep returning to. A partnership rather than a hierarchy." "I want that," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "Whatever shape it takes. If it means you're gone for months gathering specimens while I manage the estate and the tenants and everything I've finally learned to tend properly, then that's what it means. If it means we build a life that looks nothing like what either of our families expected of a marriage, I'll take that gladly, so long as it's built on something real." Charlotte studied him a long moment, and Nathaniel watched the last of her careful guard finally fully lower. "I'm not ready to say everything is healed," she said softly. 10 years doesn't unwind in 4 months, however much good those 4 months contained. There will be days, I expect, when the old hurt surfaces without warning, and I'll need you to be patient with that, the same way you've been patient with everything else." "I will be, however long it takes. But I find—" Charlotte continued, her voice unsteady now, thick with an emotion she no longer seemed inclined to hide, "that I want to try. Not because you've earned some perfect version of forgiveness, because I don't know that such a thing exists, but because I've watched you become someone I actually recognize as worthy of trying with, and that's more than I ever expected to say again." After that morning I walked out of our kitchen. Nathaniel felt something break open in his chest, warm and overwhelming, and he reached for her hand, slow and careful, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished. She didn't. Her fingers closed around his steady and certain, and for the first time in longer than either of them could rightly measure, the touch between them carried no distance at all. "Come home when you're ready," he said quietly. "Not before. Take whatever time this commission requires. I'll be there tending everything you taught me to tend for as long as it takes, and I will not once ask you to hurry back before you've built everything you set out to build. And if I need Boston more than I need the estate, some months. If this work pulls me away more often than either of us might like, then I'll learn to love a marriage that looks different than the one my parents had or yours did," Nathaniel said, and meant every word of it. "I spent 10 years wanting a wife who fit quietly into the shape I'd already decided a marriage should take. I don't want that anymore, Charlotte. I want you exactly as you are, however inconvenient that occasionally proves to my old expectations." Charlotte's eyes were bright, and this time she didn't blink the tears back, letting them fall freely as she stepped closer, closing the last small distance between them. 10 years, she whispered. And it took losing you entirely for you to finally say something like that. I know, Nathaniel said, his own voice breaking. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for how long it took. 6 months later, Carter Manor looked in some ways exactly as it always had. The same fields, the same fences, the same weathered timber. Nathaniel's father had raised a lifetime ago. But in every way that mattered, it had become an entirely different home. Charlotte's second commission had taken her away for the better part of 3 months, that autumn gathering specimens across the northeastern territories, exactly as she'd predicted. And Nathaniel had kept his word through every week of her absence, tending the tenant farms, settling debts before they became burdens, riding out to check on the widow whose roof he'd helped rebuild, and the smith whose hip still troubled him, and a dozen other small, ordinary acts of care that nobody would ever write about in any newspaper. And that mattered more than anything Josiah's poison had ever managed to spread. Josiah himself had quietly left the county sometime that winter, his reputation thoroughly ruined by his behavior at the exhibition, his ambitions toward the Carter land finally permanently extinguished. Nathaniel felt no particular satisfaction in his cousin's downfall, only a quiet relief that the matter at last was fully behind them. Charlotte returned home in the deep cold of early winter, her trunk filled with new studies, her reputation now firmly established as one of the finest botanical illustrators in the country. Her name, her full name, both halves of it printed proudly on every publication that carried her work. She found Nathaniel in the kitchen the evening of her return, and for a long moment they simply stood there, taking each other in the weight of everything they'd survived, settling comfortably, finally into something that no longer needed words to confirm. The ledger's in order, Nathaniel said, eventually breaking the silence with something almost shy. Both of them, household and the other one, the one I started keeping for the tenants. I'd like you to look them over when you have a chance, not to check my work, just because I think you'd want to see what's been built while you were away. Charlotte crossed the kitchen and looked at the books laid open on the table, her eyes moving carefully over the entries, and Nathaniel watched her expression soften into something he'd once feared he would never see, directed at him again. You've kept it exactly the way I would have, she said quietly. I had a good teacher, even if she never knew she was teaching me. Charlotte looked up at him, and the smile that broke across her face was unguarded, entirely genuine. The same smile Nathaniel had once watched her give a stranger in a crowded town hall, and ached desperately to someday earn for himself. Welcome home, he said softly. I am home, Charlotte answered, and there was no hesitation in it at all, no careful distance held in reserve. Truly this time. Outside, the New England winter settled cold and quiet over land that had nearly been lost, over a household that had nearly collapsed entirely, over a marriage that had been broken down to its barest, most honest foundations and rebuilt into something neither of them could have imagined. The morning Charlotte first walked out that door with nothing but the clothes on her back, Nathaniel Carter had spent 10 years failing to see the woman across his breakfast table. He would spend the rest of his life making certain he never failed to see her again. And Charlotte Brooks Carter, standing at last in a home built on equal ground rather than quiet obligation, understood with a certainty she had once feared she would never feel again, that some loves are not lost in the leaving, but truly found only in the long patient work of finally being seen.